and welcome to Dialogue, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. The fourth plenary session of the 18th Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party concluded Thursday. The meeting, which gathered enormous world attention, produced enormous decisions regarding the nature, content, and prospect for the rule of law in China. For example, government officials will be given demerit penalties and held accountable if they are found to have interfered in lawsuits. The top court will initiate a pilot project to set up cross-administrative region courts and prosecutorate, and as a mechanism will be established to recruit judges and prosecutors from among qualified lawyers and legal experts. This is the very first time that the plenary session of the CPC Central Committee has taken the rule of law as its central theme. The meeting is being portrayed as evidence of the party's drive to form a system serving the socialist rule of law with Chinese characteristics and build a country with socialist rule of law. But what exactly does this mean, and what is, as a result, the relationship between the party and the rule of law here in this country? Has China entered a new phase of governing by law? To answer all of these questions and the implication of the recent session, I'm joined in the studio by Victor Gao Zhikai, who is the director of the China National Association of International Studies. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
And also Mr. Edward Lehman, who is the managing director of Lehman, Lee and Xu, that is a law firm based here in Beijing. But before we go to a discussion, gentlemen, with the two of you, let's take a look at this background report to know more information about the session.
After 4 days of discussion, the fourth plenary session of the 18th Central Committee of CPC issued a communique on its efforts to advance the rule of law. It sets the goal of building a socialist legal system with Chinese characteristics. The communique says that in order to achieve the rule of law, the country must be ruled through its constitution. China, it states, has to strengthen its implementation and supervision of the constitution. The communique also adds that China needs to build a well-rounded legal system, a system capable of enforcing laws, a strict legal supervision system, a system with strong legal guarantees and improved party rules. It also sets 6 tasks to strengthen the rule of law. They include the CPC playing the leadership in the legal system to ensure judicial justice and legal society. A circuit court will be set up by the Supreme People's Court. The country will also set up a record and punishment system for officials guilty of obstructing justice. In order to professionalize its court system, China will also recruit more judicial officers from lawyers and law experts. Beijing's Global Times said on its website that the rule of law is more than a national policy. It's an indication of capability and an all-around update of the system of governance. It adds that decision makers should be firmly determined to promote the concept, from legislation and education to law enforcement. The Diplomat magazine, meanwhile, said that emphasis on rule of law is based on economic goals. It argues that the rule of law will help enforce anti-corruption measures and limit the power of local officials to resist the country's economic reforms. And an article in China's Xinhua News Agency's new media platform Thinker points out that it's abuses of power, not violations of the law by ordinary people, that has caused fairness and justice to retreat. The article also says the key to legal construction is controlling powers by placing them in the cage of a system.
You're watching Dialogue with me once again in the studio, Edward Lehman and also Victor Gao Zhikai. First of all, gentlemen, what is China's notion of rule of law? Is it in any way different from what many in the rest of the world had accepted as the concept of rule of law? Mr. Gao.
Well, first of all, very briefly, a rule of law is easier said than done in China. This is not the first time that China is talking about rule of law. China has been talking about rule of law for at least 3 decades. So there are historical reasons why up to today, rule of law has not been that successful or that prevalent. And this is exactly the reason why the fourth plenary session has gone such a big mile to emphasize again and again the new need of promoting rule of law. Now, first of all, I think...
Are you suggesting, by what you just said, that this is actually a periodic improvement on top of what happened before regarding how implemented rule of law is, and this is only another stage. Is that what you're trying to say?
No, I hope this time it's a major breakthrough. This will really change the nature of the so-called rule of law in China, that compared with what we have.
What is the
been
nature
witnessing.
that you're talking about here?
No, first of all, historically speaking, rule of law has been talked a lot, but in reality it's not a success. Why? Because if I'm a judge, if I'm a court, if I'm the judiciary system in its entirety, I'm very much kept captive by the party, kept by the leaders like the governors or the party secretary generals, or party secretaries in the provinces or in the cities, and I'm constantly being called upon by my law professors at law school, or my alumni in the law school, my relatives keep calling me, etc.
What breakthrough are you talking
about? So there is no independence of the judiciary system to a very large extent. This is exactly the nature of the situation that we need to address. We need to re-enhance the independence of the judiciary system, and that will involve many, many things. It's not just one step that is required. It's multiple steps that need to be required. Eventually, by the end of the day, the judiciary system will be more and more independent. It will be immunized from interferences from many other parties.
So, yes or no, China's notion of rule of law different or similar to the others?
Oh, very different. For example, in the Western countries, there is a strong emphasis on the separations of the government. For example, the administrative branch, the legislative branch, the executive branch in China. In China, no. In China, we still have a political system, and on top of that system is the rule of the Communist Party. And this is what Deng Xiaoping has been calling socialism with Chinese characteristics.
I got your point. Mr. Lehman, after Dr. Gao explained his understanding of the significance of the meeting this time, what do you think is the achievements about the rule of law, or actually a further step in the possibility of achieving the rule of law, which probably can be even better explained than the phrase called governance by law?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Dr. Gao is saying, in as much as that there has to be a clear line in the sand, which is drawn. I think that what's different about all the things that have happened in the past is that now this has been the focal point of this meeting, and they're saying from top down, this is the direction we're going to go to. In anything that you do, especially with something like the rule of law, it's like turning a ship around. I think that it takes a very long time to do that, the bigger the ship that it is, and China's a very big ship. And I think what they've done is they've said, we're going to turn that ship. Before they were talking about it in an ancillary way, but now they're saying this is what we're going to do, this is the direction we want to go to. And now, I agree, the devil or God is in the details of how the rule of law is to be implemented. But what they're saying now is we're going to govern by the rule of law. How we get there is going to be the difficult
Let's
path.
talk about how we get there, because in the decisions published right after the fourth session concluded, there are some details regarding how this, what they call rule of law, is going to be implemented. For example, if we talk about governance by law, there's one part specifically deal with that the plenum said it would assess cadres according, or officials, according to their, quote, compliance with the law. Of course, details is not clear at this moment because this is really a general central decision, and all the details need to be coming out later. But if the officials, particularly at local level, are being assessed, their performances, by whether they are complying with the laws or not, and whether, another paragraph of the decision also indicated that whether they have any record of, quote-unquote, interfering with the law, will that have a huge impact on how local governments and how local officials are working with the law within their judiciary system or within their localities?
Yeah, this is a major step forward. Up to now, I would say, rule of law in China is more or less like a rule of politics and law with multiple interferences in the rule of law. This is not working very well. So going forward, it will be more and more clearly defined rule of law, which will include many things. One thing your quotation actually emphasizes is that if I'm a party official or a government official, I can no longer just call up the judge and say, you need to decide. You need to decide in favor of the plaintiff or the dissenting. Or I cannot just call the judge and say, you need to have this case dismissed, or I will shut down your court, or I will have you fired, or I will withhold the budget so that you have no more money to pay. Or I can no longer tell him, if you do not do what I tell you to do, next year your building will no longer be continued. For example, your lease will be recalled. So all these interference actually happen in China on a daily basis.
All right, this is a wonderful decision as you have explained, but on the other hand, Mr. Lehman, as we know, what Mr. Gao talked about is direct, clear interference in the judicial system, in the independent judiciary that we are talking about. But certainly there are other ways of influencing, in any country, I guess, in any culture, how the rule of law is being implemented and whether there is going to be any large degree independence of the judiciary system. So how about the other leeways that maybe local officials will be able to figure out, or local governments will be able to figure out in order to interfere in the decisions made by the judiciary system, or try to zigzag their way in order to be not, quote unquote, limited by what the law says. So how are we, is this clear at this moment by the decision, those things can be prevented or can be eliminated from the picture forever?
Yeah, I don't think they can be prevented. I mean, I think that you've got to set up a framework in order to be able to stop these kind of things we're talking about. When you mentioned the idea of where they mentioned demerits, if they're not following the laws and regulations, if there's a reporting system where someone is actually going to report them and they're going to actually take that seriously, then it will start to be interacting. I do see just in the climate that we have today, when I have been to administrative bodies now, where in the past they would not bring out the law and they'd be waving off the law when we would show them what the law was in administrative thing. They're actually reading it. They're showing us the law when our clients come in and discuss these things. So I think the climate's changing. I think it's confusing. In a common law system, they make a decision, and the decision is followed by the court. So there's a separation of powers, and we know from a case that that's the way we should follow things. And if you don't do it, then it's wrong.
Right.
In China, it takes a longer time to get the system in place. They make these edicts, like we talked about today in the plenary session, that concluded yesterday, and then it'll take them a long time to try to figure out how to make it work.
Let me just be a little bit specific here, because we talk about principles a lot, but all of these principles are supposed to serve specific purposes in protecting people's rights, in protecting the rule of law. Several issues on the hand when it comes to local levels here in China. Local level government official corruption, for example. Land grab, for example, illegal land grab for real estate development or for industrialization at local level in order to appear wonderful on the GDP level by the local government performances. And also, we also have different types of various types of local officials corruption. I wouldn't be able to list all of them. So will any of these, for example, pollution, how to prevent pollution, how to implement those rules and laws revolving environmental protection is another one. So how will this principle, Dr. Gao, that we have just mentioned, performances of the official and also making sure local officials not interfering in the judicial process, this will eventually have an impact on all of these very, very important rights of the people at local level?
Well, if you are talking about local governments and all the corruptions which happen on a very large scale in different parts of China, then I would say that part of the reason why so much corruption happens is because of the failure of the rule of law. Because if we have a very robust rule of law system, many of these corruption cases will not have happened in the first place, because government officials and party officials will be overwhelmed and will be awed by the ferocity of the rule of law, and they will be prohibited from even thinking about corruption. That's why the breakthrough of the fourth plenum in terms of beefing up rule of law is well intended, and it will result in a better system for rule of law.
We all understand that the policy would really lead us somewhere, but at the same time the mentality is the most difficult thing to be changed. Over the years, China has feudalism society for thousands of years, and that has not been at the very central part of people's mentality, including those officials. Of course, over the past 2 decades, with the rule of law being built, despite ups and downs, we still see some hope, but that takes time. So at this moment, is it more about establishing systems to implement it strictly so that a mentality could be gradually established and therefore further steps of rule of law can be further promoted and implemented? Is that the right explanation of what we are seeing right now with this fourth plenum?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think they've drawn a line in the sand and they say this is where we want to be, and now how do we get to that place? I think a lot of this starts too. I mean, in being a lawyer here in China for many, many years now, people are like, is there any law here? What's going on? What are you doing here? I mean, it was more a system of relationships. And every kind of presentation you do on foreign direct investment, they talk about guanxi, they talk about relationships. They don't talk about the rule of law.
It can be important in any culture, but here, of course, it seems to go a little bit further than what should be expected.
Right. And it would be better just say, hey, these are the rules and regulations, it's transparent, and this is what you can expect, and that's better. And so now I think what has to happen is an education from a very young age with young people today that they do have recourse through the rule of law and that they don't have to find relationships to make things better, and that it's a fair playing field and justice is blind. And that would be a start. I mean, that's a long process.
Of course, above the rule of law mentality could be maintained, or I mean, could be always maintained by some officials, even though that shouldn't be the direction they take. But on the other hand, the strict implementation of rule of law could also hurt the interests of certain interest groups. So we are seeing not only just decisions being made, but rather future challenges about implementing the decisions that we are seeing right here. Dr. Gao.
No, I would say to move from what rule of law we have today to the better rule of law that the fourth plenum has prescribed for, it will take years. It will take fundamental changes, and it will be easier said than done, mainly because we need to actually change almost every aspect, almost all the ingredients which constitute collectively together as the rule of law.
Right.
For example, a judge in China cannot exercise his judiciary judgment independently because he is, to a very large extent, held captive by many, many stakeholders. The party secretary of that city or of that province.
You're talking about the local judge.
The local judge.
At the local court.
Can call him to give his opinion.
You mentioned that earlier at the very beginning of our show, the limits of the local judges, for example, and this quote-unquote independence they could enjoy because now they're being appointed sometimes by the local officials, their salaries coming from local governments, and their promotions also depends on how they're being viewed by local governments, and therefore there's impossible to be judiciary independence. But we are going to continue, gentlemen, our discussion about what really should be or has been the nature of achievements by the fourth plenum, particularly on the rule of law. We'll be back after this.
Thank you.
Welcome back. You're watching live edition of Dialogue. We're focusing on the decisions being made at the first plenary session of the 18th Central Committee of CPC. With me in the studio, once again, we have Victor Gao Zhikai, Director of China National Association of International Studies. He himself is a law major, and also Edward Lehman, Managing Director of Lehman, Lee and Xu. That's a law firm based here in Beijing. Of course, he himself is a lawyer. With me to talk about this, we earlier touched on the logic and the footprint of the rule of law decisions being made at the fourth plenum. Let's focus a little bit about whether the decisions can be well implemented. It's important to have a historical perspective, I think, in any country, in any culture. Let's just take a look at very short history that we have witnessed over the past 2 to 3 years since the Xi administration comes into office. Mr. Xi Jinping himself, the Chinese president, and also the party secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, he is a law major in doctorate. Meanwhile, since he and his colleagues comes into office, forced labor camp has been erased from the picture. Secondly, there has been very high-level anti-corruption campaign going on in China for 2 consecutive years, one would say, and in such a manner that some say even shocked the rest of the world on a positive tone. Of course, there's debate about the rule of law and how law should be implemented during this process in the anti-corruption campaign. But when you look at the track record of this administration, many are wondering about the achievements and the decisions being made at the fourth plenary session, how it's really related to the eventual vision that this administration has toward the rule of law at the end. Dr. Gao, you've been nodding your head here. Yeah. I want you to not to explain too much, but rather give us your analysis.
Yeah, very briefly, I would say if we believe in what President Xi Jinping and his associates are telling China and telling the world, then the China they want to build will be more transparent. The government will be up to standard and up to the scrutiny of the people. They will be held accountable by many, many standards, and corruption will be minimized, if not eliminated. And the people's interests will be put in the forefront. And the government will be serving the people rather than kind of overriding on top of the people in China. So this will be a much better China, which will be much more welcomed by the total population in China, and will reinvigorate China. And in this whole environment, the decision on improving rule of law in China becomes a very important piece, because without rule of law, what we will have is rule of politics or rule by men. And it will be very arbitrary. It will be very, very discretionary.
At this moment, not only at the very central level, the rule of law has been further emphasized, but also at the local level, according to the decisions being made at the fourth plenum, it is a must that when local officials trying to draw rules and regulations for their localities, they have to comply with the existing laws and regulations. That is going to be a big difference. As we have seen, Mr. Lehman, probably you know this better than I do as a practicing lawyer here in China, that sometimes the new rules and the new local practices are very much contradictory to the widely accepted rule and regulation that is clearly publicized in China. So how much do you expect this culture to change? Will this very firm administrative and party announcement be able to further that process of change?
Yeah, you know, I'm encouraged by it. And I think that, again, Xi Jinping just studying law and having a law background, I mean, the United States, most of the presidents were lawyers or practicing lawyers at one point in their career, with very few exceptions. And so in our country, we started out with rule of law straight away, and that was the most important thing. It started out differently for People's Republic of China. And but I think that this is a great direction to go in, and I do think that the idea that this is a very important thing and that we're going to look to law, we're going to look to lawyers to be able to interpret, we're going to look to the judiciary.
Right.
I agree there's a lot of problems, but I think these problems can be overcome.
But of course, a lot of details are, as you said, in the devils rather, are in the details. One of the things that the decision was about has to do with the role of the National People's Congress, which is what some call China's version of a parliament, but of course China argues is different from so-called Western philosophy concept of a parliament. But it does have the role of monitoring governments. It does have the role of interpreting the Constitution and also draw, approve, and oppose certain rules and regulations and certain laws in this country. And therefore, the emphasis of the role of the National People's Congress, Dr. Gao, many see that as an interesting point coming out of the decision. But of course, how much it can be done is also a matter of time. But the thing is, what kind of monitoring role can it really achieve? Particularly when you talk about the rule of law still young here in China?
Well, first of all, the National People's Congress is supposedly the highest body of power in China. However, in reality, even though many delegates to the National People's Congress are elected by the people, sometimes through direct elections, their empowerment is still very limited, mainly because the legislation in China is done mostly by the executive side. Once they come up with a framework, they propose it to the National People's Congress, and National People's Congress go through a certain level of debate, argument, etc., and then eventually it's adopted into legislation. So legislative work for the NPC is not that much of a big amount compared with, let's say, their counterparties in Western countries. On the other hand, I think the NPC up to today does not exercise a lot of supervision or monitoring role at all. And this part of the role is, as a matter of fact, for example, if we look at the U.S. Congress, is a very, very important part of their functions, because they need to oversee the budget, exercise, etc., etc. In China, I think we need to beef this up, so that the executive side will know that whatever they do eventually will be re-scrutinized by the National People's Congress. It's not for checks and balances, it's to make sure that the executive work will be properly done and will be in compliance of the law.
That is a very interesting point, because when the question about who is going to monitor the party and who is going to monitor the government, that is an interesting answer being provided. But how much will that answer be implemented? What do you think might be some of the contents of these things that are important in order to implement at least this specific point?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that the National People's Congress, 2,989 people, it's unwieldy as far as the numbers are concerned, and how does one, and that's why they have the standing committee, and the standing committee helps out. So how will it be implemented? What I think needs to be done as a practitioner, or someone who's here working day to day, is we have to look at the civil procedure or the procedural rules and regulations. You can talk about rule of law all you want. If you don't have access to the courts, if the courts are not accepting cases. So I was in Qingdao not too long ago, and I was with some lawyers who were trying to get some cases filed, and the judges are pushing these papers back and making it very difficult to file these cases. I'm just talking about
that.
A very practical
Also has a lot to do with another point which we really should mention, but we're really running out of time. This is a gigantic topic we're talking about, which is what is going to be the role of the local courts, and how local courts are going to recruit the most talented people here in China, because many of the lawyers are being, or rather the court workers are being paid with very minimum salaries. How to attract all of these people and make China's rule of law team really the best that the country could have. Those are tremendous questions that also need to be answered. But many of the guiding principles, though, gentlemen, are being provided by the fourth plenary session in its final decision. We are looking forward to, as both of you mentioned, to further implementation of the spirit of the decision and also the next step of China's rule of law. But we want to thank both of you. We're really running out of time. Thank you so much for coming over to this very important discussion, Victor Gao Zhikai and also Edward Lehman. And thank you for watching. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.